Welcome to the Financial Integrity Hub's podcast. The Financial Integrity Hub pioneers research and explores how law and governance strategies can be designed, implemented, and enforced to support anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing. This podcast is proudly sponsored by Identity, a RegTech providing financial institutions assurance that they are meeting AUSTRAC reporting obligations. The platform allows regulated entities to gain visibility over transactions, improve auditability, automate manual processes, and reduce the risk of non-compliance. Your host is Isabel Nicholas. Isabel is a researcher at the Financial Integrity Hub. She teaches financial crime at Macquarie Law School and interviews global and domestic experts on trends and market insights for the podcast.
Welcome back to the Financial Integrity Hub's podcast. Today I'm joined by Dr. Jamie Ferril, a research fellow at the Financial Integrity Hub and discipline lead of financial crime studies at the Australian Graduate School of Policing and Security of Charles Sturt University. We dive deep into the topic of trade-based money laundering. Jamie shares some real-world examples to illustrate the tactics and methods used in trade-based money laundering. She reveals the high-risk industries and key red flags that financial institutions must stay vigilant about to detect potential instances of money laundering through trade. Jamie discusses the weaknesses that exist in our current AML frameworks and considered what improvements might strengthen our ability to combat trade-based money laundering. Jamie also considers how businesses, especially those involved in international trade, can enhance their due diligence processes to mitigate the risk of inadvertently being involved in trade-based money laundering schemes. Thanks to our listeners for tuning in. You can find our previous episodes by searching the Financial Integrity Hub at Macquarie Law School on LinkedIn or on Macquarie University's website. Dr. Jamie Ferril is the discipline lead of financial crime studies at the Australian Graduate School of Policing and Security at Charles Sturt University. Jamie has nearly a decade of law enforcement experience, having worked for the Canadian federal government before commencing an academic career. Jamie's research focuses on border security, economic security, money laundering, and transnational organised crime. As mentioned, Jamie has recently joined the Financial Integrity Hub as a research fellow. Welcome to the podcast, Jamie.
Thank you so much for having me.
Let's get right into it. Can you define trade-based money laundering for our listeners who may not be familiar with the term and why it's a significant concern in financial crime?
Sure. So trade-based money laundering, or TBML, is defined by the Financial Action Task Force as the process of disguising the proceeds of crime by moving value through the use of trade transactions in an attempt to legitimize their illicit origin. So there's a number of offenses like smuggling or trade fraud that may resemble TBML, but they really differ in purpose. So organizations and individuals involved in TBML, the main purpose is to exploit vulnerabilities in international trade to move value across international borders, really, again, to disguise that origin or the nature of illicit proceeds, which can come from a number of predicate crimes. So unlike trade-related predicate offenses like wildlife trafficking or drug smuggling, TBML's not so much about the movement of goods, but rather the movement of value, which those trade transactions really facilitate. So it can be done through generally misinvoicing, so under-invoicing or over-invoicing of goods and services, or falsely describing goods and services, or multiple invoice of goods and services. And that's just a few of them. There are a number of different methods involved in it. And TBML is a really effective way of integrating large volumes of criminal proceeds with legitimate funds. And it's quite attractive to organized crime groups because it's hard to detect and track and investigate because it is transnational in nature and so complex with the international trade system involved. In terms of why it's a significant concern in the realm of financial crime, like all money laundering offenses and other financial crimes, it has really adverse effects on economies and societies. It perpetuates these criminal activities like illicit wildlife trade and bribery and corruption, and even tax evasion. And this artificial manipulation of value that we see in TBML creates economic imbalances, and that subjects legitimate businesses to unfair competition across goods and services. And finally, and really significantly, it results in revenue losses, especially for developing countries that are already striving to attain targets for domestic resource generation.
Thank you, Jamie. Could you share some real-world examples or maybe some case studies that illustrate the tactics and the methods that are used in trade-based money laundering?
Sure. So there was a relatively recent case actually in Australia, and it tracked between 2014 and 2017 that more than $100 million in drug money was being funneled through Australian banks each year before it was routed to other destinations across Southeast Asia and the Middle East. And basically, in this case, drugs were smuggled from Latin America, mostly Colombian origin, and sold in North America. So the funds are just there in North America. They can't just be spent because that creates that direct line back to the drug smugglers and the drug dealers. So the funds were transmitted in smaller amounts to bank accounts across Southeast Asia and then layered through a number of different Australian bank accounts. And again, that money can't just be spent because there's still quite a direct line there. So electronic devices like smartphones, digital cameras, laptops, that kind of thing were purchased in Australia with that money, so small purchases, and shipped overseas in containers in order to move the fund. So there was moving the value without being detected and to further disguise that origin. And the invoices of the shipments sent overseas were deliberately undervalued. So once the goods made it overseas, they were sold for their proper face value, and that allowed for the offshore collaborators to collect the profits. So there's a number of methods, again, interwoven in there. It was that shipment of the electronic goods over to Southeast Asia and the undervaluing of them, which allowed that value to be moved without actually shifting the physical money anywhere.
Thank you, Jamie. Are there specific industries or regions that are more susceptible to trade-based money laundering? And if so, why?
Yeah, so those two actually go together, kind of hand in hand. The industry or commodity susceptibilities go along with the region and its respective susceptibilities. So, for example, again, going back to Latin America, gold, palm oil, and scrap metals have been linked frequently to TBML cases. And those are some of the commodities from their key export sector with high volume, limited oversight, and links to other issues like corruption. And if we go across to, say, Uganda, gold is vulnerable to TBML schemes because it's this really cash-intensive industry with limited oversight, and the origins of gold are really hard to trace. And that makes it easy in that region specifically for commingling of smuggled gold with legally mined gold. And the predicate offense focus can really play into this too. So, for example, the US has quite a long-standing focus on the war on drugs, which is reflected in their policy priorities. So on their end, they're more likely to go after cases where drugs were involved as the predicate offense, logically speaking anyway. And then more generally, I guess, in the commodity or industry side, the Global Financial Integrity Report and Financial Action Task Force reports have ranked some of the most common merchandise and industries, again, used in those TBML schemes. So they've come up with vehicles, metals and minerals, agricultural products, and textiles as the most common. And really what it comes down to is any sector that's prone to gaps in the application of AML measures is really vulnerable to exploitation. And then more generally, again, zoomed out on the region, it can affect any region. We see it all across the world. It's a global trade system and it does affect everyone. But when organized crime, illicit economies, or corruption are really prevalent, it's more likely. And then there's this, if there's a really strategic location for legal international trade, that inherently opens up channels for illicit trade transactions as well by that virtue of volume.
What are the key red flags or indicators that financial institutions and authorities should be vigilant about to detect potential instances of trade-based money laundering?
So I'll preface this with the fact that banks don't really get involved with the physical goods, nor do they really have the capability to do so. They rely on documents and other people, other agencies to verify the accuracy of those documents. So complicating it even further, there are just so many entities involved in a shipping transaction, from the importers and exporters to brokers to freight forwarders to border security or customs authorities. So no one really has oversight on the entire shipment from origin to endpoint. But when we talk about all of those different people or entities involved, they can all play a role in identifying those red flags or indicators. And there's really quite a few. There's John Cassara in his Trade-Based Money Laundering book has an entire chapter dedicated towards red flags. But for a few, if there's, say, significant deviation between the value of the commodity as reported on an invoice and the normal kind of ballpark fair market price, that's a red flag. If the weight of the shipment doesn't match the listed contents, if there's routing through the supply chain through high-risk countries or entities, if the size of the shipment is inconsistent with the exporter's normal business activity, or if the routing just is illogical, if it's circuitous or not direct, it's being transshipped through a questionable area and it doesn't make economic sense, then that could be a significant red flag. If there's opaque business structures being used at points throughout the transaction, or if simply goods present valuation difficulties, so things like gold, precious stones, artwork, scrap metal. Now, in TBML schemes, the merchandise involved is pretty diverse. So including, as some of the examples and case studies, there's been vehicles, electronics, textiles, toys, jewelry, counterfeit goods, everything involved in them. So connecting all of those dots can be really tricky. And there's a lot of different red flags that have to be identified throughout the process.
Really interesting. In your opinion, what gaps or weaknesses exist in the current anti-money laundering frameworks, and what improvements or innovations could strengthen our ability to combat trade-based money laundering?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think the key issue is that given this, there's an apparent rise in this focus on TBML. And given the history of our anti-money laundering, counterterrorism financing regulations and regulators, a lot of policy making in the space seems to be kind of trying to adapt AML-CTF regulation from the financial sector and applying it to the trade sector. Now, the financial sector is highly regulated, and they have, for all intents and purposes, done a pretty good job of getting a handle on the landscape of our current anti-money laundering and money laundering challenges. But that's kind of also posed some unintentional consequences of perhaps displacing criminals to the trade sector. So just an example of that, in Australia, as controls on large cash deposits at ATMs have increased over the last few years, criminals have most likely increase their use of TBML to hide their profits. So as one door closes, another opens. Now, compared to financial institutions or banks, we face a really different environment in trade. Like I said before in one of the last questions there's just so many entities involved in the trade process. We aren't dealing with this sophisticated and entrenched institutional mechanism for compliance like we see in financial institutions. So in some cases, the banks or other financial institutions may handle some of the finance aspect of the trade transaction. There are a lot of different moving parts that can manipulate any security that might offer. So the Financial Action Task Force, for example, was advocating for imposing these reporting requirements, much like the ones that apply to the financial sector, on the trade sector and traders in particular. And similarly, many, including Financial Action Task Force, advocate this AML-CTF auditing for traders. And while there's very real reasons to apply those regulations to traders themselves rather than just the financial intermediaries, the costs and logistics of the implementation raise huge concerns, particularly as TBML is a very under-researched area and there's just sheer lack of data. So despite the highly regulated environment of financial institutions, they're just not well positioned to detect and report TBML, given that they don't provide direct finance for the majority of trade transactions. But on the flip side, there's, again, good reasons to learn from the decades of AML-CTF experience in the financial sector. So there's been little attention, I think, given to the ways in which a regulatory regime might actually be tailored to the specific requirements of the trade sector. And on top of that, they're compounding that. There's really no symmetrical treatment between the control of exports and imports. For exports, controls are generally quite minimal, unless we're talking about defense goods or dual-use goods, which can be taken advantage of in TBML schemes. But in terms of your question about what innovations could strengthen the ability to combat this, a really promising tool to strengthen this are trade transparency units. And those really facilitate the sharing and analysis of import-export data between countries. And one of the best ways to detect TBML is to compare the exports of one country with the imports of its trading partners to detect discrepancies. That's just logical. So the U.S. Immigration Customs Enforcement, they established their trade transparency unit back in 2004. And it was based on the premise, again, that governments on both sides of trade transactions need to be able to compare and analyze trade data to identify those anomalies in trade transactions. And these trade transparency units are set up between the U.S. and 19 partner countries now. And the goal is to exchange and analyze trade data to identify potential cases of TBML. And at the core of this concept is it's a data analysis and research for trade transparency system called DARTS. And it's a computer system run out of Immigration Customs Enforcement in the US, designed to analyze import and export and financial data of the US and its foreign partners that it has partnered up with for the purpose of identifying these trade anomalies and financial irregularities. And these anomalies and irregularities, they're often indicators of money laundering, and as well as things like customs fraud, contraband smuggling, and even tax evasion. But the issue with this is the trade transparency units in their current form, they're not as good as they could be. So in my opinion, getting more countries on board and increasing international cooperation and collaboration could really help further this initiative. So there have been lapses in information sharing, and differing priorities always comes into play when we're talking about different countries, and limitations in the data systems between the US and their partner trade transparency units. And also the data exchange, it's not in real time, so that can really hamper detection. Now, just recently, Canada has promisingly announced that they're going to be introducing legislative amendments to enhance the authorities of Canada Border Services Agency to create a trade transparency unit within the agency to detect, deter, and disrupt these trade-based financial crimes. But beyond the trade transparency units, there's definitely opportunity for further collaboration between countries and international bodies through a range of other activities, like developing appropriate international anti-money laundering standards, for one, providing training across everyone involved in that supply chain, capacity building, technical assistance, and establishing information sharing methods, and really providing ongoing law enforcement cooperation through the likes of task forces. And of course, the rise of technology in this space and talks of integrating blockchain for supply chain security are initiatives that are on the rise as well. So all that to say, it really takes cooperation and collaboration between countries. TBML inherently involves at least 2 countries. Some of the recent reports showing that on average, there's at least 3. And without sharing information between each other, it's virtually impossible to detect activity. So while the regulations and legislation are domestic in nature, the infrastructure to cooperate and collaborate must be a priority to tackle this, which can be at odds with things like privacy laws, national priorities even, and at the other end of the spectrum, issues like corruption.
Thank you so much, Jamie, for your insights, for your time today, and for joining us on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
The Financial Integrity Hub's research equips Australia and the international community with the knowledge, tools, and insights to understand, identify, and disrupt illicit finance threats. If you're interested in seeing more from the Financial Integrity Hub, don't forget to follow us on LinkedIn to see our posts and events. We post a few times each week on breaking news and the latest research. We would like to thank Dr. Doran Goldbarsht for his academic advice and Isabel Nicholas for hosting.